Over the weekend, President Donald Trump's high-stakes strategy in the Middle East suffered a conspicuous rebuke at the NATO summit in The Hague, where he was met with audible boos as he arrived, an unmistakable sign that allies are growing impatient with his hard-line approach to Iran. In a series of remarks to reporters shortly thereafter, before we unpack the implications of these developments, if you value staying informed, hit like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. He sought to defend his decision to unleash a sudden and unprovoked missile strike on Iranian soil, insisting it was necessary to send a clear message, even as fresh evidence suggested those strikes fell well short of crippling Tehran's capabilities. Global capitals were caught off guard by the intensity and speed of the operation, which saw cruise missiles launched from naval vessels in the northern Persian Gulf alongside precision-guided munitions dropped by bombers over western Iran. Satellite imagery confirmed damage to multiple military depots and air defense facilities near Isfahan and Kermanshah, but analysts noted Iran's nuclear infrastructure remained largely intact, contrary to the administration's initial assertions of total destruction. Tehran's leadership denounced the assault as a violation of international law and national sovereignty and vowed retaliation in a manner and at a time of their choosing, even as President Trump called on the United Nations to broker an immediate ceasefire and restart peace negotiations. At the NATO summit itself, President Trump's arrival underscored deep fissures within the alliance. Delegates and staffers could be heard jeering as his motorcade pulled into the World Forum, reflecting frustration over his simultaneous questioning of NATO's core commitment, collective defense. In comments en route to the summit, he had cast doubt on whether the United States would automatically defend its allies in the event of an attack, suggesting the guarantee depends on the definition. Even after other leaders reaffirmed Washington's pledge to Article 5, the boos persisted, highlighting a credibility gap that European partners fear could undermine the alliance's cohesion in the face of other threats. Back in Washington, congressional leaders reacted sharply. Some Republican lawmakers praised the strikes as a long-overdue deterrent against Iran's regional meddling, while others expressed concern at the lack of consultation and legal authority for launching an attack without congressional approval. Senior Democrats questioned the prudence of escalating hostilities without first exhausting diplomatic options and demanded briefings on the intelligence that justified the strikes, warning that the United States risked sliding into a wider regional war. Legal experts pointed to the Constitution's provision that only Congress may declare war and warned that bypassing this process could erode long-standing norms of checks and balances. Regional actors scrambled to reassess their positions. Israel viewed the strikes as vindication of its long-standing concerns about Iran's missile program and quietly provided logistical support. Gulf Arab states publicly welcomed America's show of force but privately worried that any further escalation could send oil prices soaring and fuel domestic unrest. In Baghdad, Iraqi leaders condemned the use of their airspace for the attack and summoned the American ambassador to demand assurances that Iraq would not become a battleground in a wider conflict. Militia groups aligned with Iran conducted symbolic rocket launches toward training ranges near the border as a warning measure rather than a genuine military escalation. European powers worked behind the scenes to reopen diplomatic channels. France and Germany issued joint appeals for de-escalation, urging both sides to return to dialogue and warning that military action alone could never resolve the ideological and strategic divide driving the region's violence. Britain's foreign minister emphasized that any sustainable peace would require addressing a broader set of issues, including missile proliferation, proxy militias, and human rights concerns, areas that fell outside the narrow focus of the recent strikes. European diplomats discreetly reached out to their American counterparts, proposing a framework that balanced credible deterrence with a clear path to negotiations. In Iran, state media broadcast footage of the damaged compounds, and local commanders vowed to respond with force when the time was right. Hardline factions used the episode to rally support, portraying the bombardment as proof of Western aggression and a unifying cause for nationalist sentiment. Economists cautioned that renewed hostilities risked spiking global oil prices, disrupting supply chains already strained by other conflicts, and sending inflation higher. Shipping companies rerouted vessels away from the Strait of Hormuz, a vital choke point for world energy shipments, while speculators drove up futures contracts in anticipation of further instability. NATO's summit discussions turned quickly to broader questions of strategic autonomy and burden sharing. Some European capitals argued that the recent events underscored the need for Europe to develop its own defense capabilities rather than relying on unpredictable American commitments. Calls grew for deeper integration of military planning, procurement, and operations within the European Union, a move that could reshape the transatlantic security landscape over the coming decades. Other allies cautioned that any hasty push toward autonomy risked undermining existing structures and that cooperation with Washington remained indispensable given the scale of current threats. Meanwhile, Russia and China watched closely, skeptical of American intentions yet concerned about regional spillover. Moscow reiterated its opposition to unilateral military action and stressed the importance of preserving international agreements, including the nuclear accord negotiated in 2015. Beijing likewise spoke against military escalation and proposed that both sides engage through direct dialogue, emphasizing the principle of non-intervention. Both powers signaled support for a balanced United Nations resolution condemning aggression on all sides while avoiding singling out any one party, thus reflecting their broader geopolitical interests in maintaining regional influence. Public opinion in the United States remained divided. Polls showed a majority of Americans uneasy about the sudden bombing campaign, yet supportive of a firm stance against Iran's perceived threats. Many respondents feared the sequence of striking first, then calling for peace pointed to a contradictory policy that could undermine long-term stability. Others applauded the display of strength, viewing it as necessary to deter future provocations. Grassroots protests sprang up in major cities as anti-war activists decried the administration's willingness to resort to force without exploring all diplomatic avenues first. Legal challenges began to take shape as civil society groups and members of Congress prepared lawsuits and resolutions accusing the president of overstepping constitutional authority. Advocacy organizations filed Freedom of Information requests seeking internal documents about the strike planning and decision-making processes. Constitutional scholars debated the scope of executive war powers in law journals and at academic forums, with many arguing that a return to clear legislation defining the limits of military action was overdue. At the same time, think tanks and academic institutions organized panels to explore scenarios for the conflict's next phases. War game simulations assessed the likely Iranian military response, potential disruptions to commercial shipping, and second-order effects on proxy conflicts in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Recommendations ranged from calibrated sanctions coupled with discrete back-channel talks to multilateral confidence-building measures that included reciprocal military transparency and humanitarian cooperation. As this debate unfolded, civil society groups in the Middle East called for protection of civilians and unhindered humanitarian access. Aid organizations warned that the bombing could disrupt relief operations for vulnerable populations in border regions and that any escalation risked displacing thousands more. Emergency medical teams and relief convoys had already faced delays due to security concerns and border closures in the immediate aftermath of the strikes. By the time the summit concluded, leaders faced the difficult task of restoring a semblance of unity. The final declaration reaffirmed the principle of collective defense, promised a renewed commitment to dialogue, and pledged support for diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions. Yet the language was notably more cautious than in previous years, reflecting the discomfort many allies felt at recent unilateral actions. Some delegates privately acknowledged that the summit had papered over deeper fractures and that future crises could expose them further. In the days following the summit, back-channel efforts intensified. Senior diplomats from Europe and the Gulf states shuttled between capitals, offering to host meetings aimed at drafting a step-by-step de-escalation plan. Proposals included mutual moratoria on air and missile strikes, establishment of joint incident investigation mechanisms, and phased sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable steps by Iran to curb its missile program and proxy support. President Trump, meanwhile, continued to emphasize his readiness to negotiate, insisting that the strikes had strengthened America's bargaining position. At a press conference, he said that showing strength was necessary before discussions, and that Iran had never taken peace offers seriously until faced with consequences. Critics countered that this approach risked playing into the hands of hardliners on both sides who benefited from ongoing confrontation, and that genuine dialogue required a more balanced sequence of confidence-building measures. Within Iran, a parallel debate emerged. Moderate voices called for cautious engagement, warning that retaliatory violence could provoke a spiral that Iran could not control given the asymmetry of conventional military power. Hardline factions pushed back, insisting that any compromise would be seen as weakness, encouraging further aggression. Supreme leader aides met behind closed doors to weigh immediate reprisals against the long-term risks of open conflict with the United States. Economic ripples spread beyond oil markets. Investors grew cautious about Middle Eastern equities and currencies, fearing contagion to broader emerging markets. Some companies began diversifying supply chains away from the region and re-examining risk assessments for operations in adjacent countries. Multinational corporations issued statements urging stability and warning of potential losses if the crisis deepened. Religious leaders also spoke out. Prominent clerics in both Sunni and Shia communities called for calm, urging political leaders to prioritize the welfare of civilians and to seek forgiveness and reconciliation over military glory. Ecumenical groups organized interfaith prayers for peace, gathering representatives of different faith traditions to send a message that communities wanted respite from geopolitical strife. Educational institutions in the region adapted curricula to address the evolving situation. Universities hosted public lectures on the history of U.S.-Iran relations and on conflict resolution techniques, encouraging students to think critically about the drivers of war and peace. Student movements held forums and debates highlighting the perspectives of youth who would bear the long-term consequences of current choices. As the second week after the summit began, fresh questions arose about the durability of any ceasefire and about whether Iran would seize opportunities for covert escalation through proxies. Intelligence agencies tracked unusual movements among militias in Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, and reported increased communications intercepts suggesting preparations for potential asymmetric responses aimed at raising the cost of American involvement without crossing thresholds that would trigger full-scale war. Washington responded by repositioning naval assets to demonstrate readiness while also dispatching a high-level envoy to Europe to coordinate policy. The envoy's mandate included assessing European proposals for a joint diplomatic roadmap and exploring the possibility of a broader regional security dialogue that might include Gulf Arab states, Turkey, and perhaps even Israel and Iran. Though unlikely in the short term, such a forum would represent a significant departure from current bilateral conditioned diplomacy. Behind-the-scenes efforts also encompassed back-channel contacts between intelligence services. Encouraged by third-party intermediaries, these discussions aimed to clarify red lines to prevent miscalculations that could kindle unintended clashes. The intelligence community worked to verify that Iranian leadership commands reached proxy groups to avoid accidental escalations and to establish clearer channels of communication for crisis management. As the world weighed the prospects, the enduring image remained that moment in The Hague when a head of state was publicly booed at a major summit. It underscored how far political trust can erode when military actions are perceived as unpredictable unilateral measures. For President Trump, the challenge now lies in demonstrating that the force he wields can be harnessed as part of a coherent strategy that delivers both security and diplomacy. Without that balance, the risk is that each subsequent strike begets a stronger reaction, leaving neither side able to step back from the brink. As this story continues to unfold, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for ongoing insights and in-depth analysis.